Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Grcevich. I'm the president and founder of Key Ministry, and I'm here today to share the third part of a three-part video series that we've done on inclusion strategies for individuals and families impacted by mental illness. In our first two videos, we talked about our first four inclusion strategies: putting together your team, evaluating your ministry environments, including folks in those activities that are most critical for discipleship, and developing an appropriate communication plan. Today we're going to finish up with our last three strategies, and we use the acronym TEACHER, so that the H in TEACHER has to do with practical helps for families who've been affected by mental illness. One of our most popular blog posts at Key Ministry last year was entitled, "We Had No Casseroles." And so in a typical church, it's not unusual for folks to have some sort of like food ministry or meal ministry, where if somebody's sick or if they have to go to a hospital or somebody has a baby, you end up getting like lots of cheesy casseroles because folks at church are really good at making that sort of food. Well, there had been a mom that was interviewed on a 60-minute segment online on the experience of having an adolescent with a serious mental illness, who talked about the ways in which her daughter, after she broke her leg and was in the hospital for surgery, they had food provided by their church every night. When their daughter went into the hospital psychiatrically because of a suicide attempt, they didn't get any casseroles. And so that one way that you can, again, overcome a great deal of stigma and, meet practical needs is to think about, well, what are some of the different ways that we provide helps to people, if they have some sort of a medical or other health concern, and extend those same courtesies to people who have, a mental health crisis or an issue. One of the services that many people, when they're dealing with a mental health condition, greatly value from their church is some direction in terms of where they might be able to go to find help. So that being able to, to recommend folks in your community who have the appropriate training and education, but will be respectful of the teaching and the values that your church imparts, to your members and your attendees, is a very valuable service that you can offer. There are many churches that are able to provide low-cost or no-cost counseling, which obviously meets, a significant immediate need. In the same way that one can have a special needs Sunday, one way of reaching out to your surrounding community is to be able to provide, perhaps host a special worship service for people who are struggling with, depression or anxiety, or folks who have a loved one wrestling with mental health issues, as a way of, being able to minister to immediate needs, and as a way of signaling to the surrounding community, that folks who are wrestling with these issues are going to be welcomed as opposed to being judged. After school programs for parents who have kids with significant emotional or behavioral or mental health concerns is oftentimes a very valuable service. And one other service that we have found that is very much needed and very much in demand by churches that we have worked with is offering respite care to families who have kids with mental illness. When you have a child who's got like serious emotional or behavioral issues, it becomes very, very difficult to find appropriately trained child care. There's a recent study from the state of Massachusetts that only 1 in 6 parents of kids with serious emotional or behavioral issues, were able to find any respite. And, earlier this year, I had an opportunity to meet with somebody who is very involved in leadership with a well-known, ministry here in the United States and around the world, where mom and dad haven't been out together on a date for 15 years because of some of the challenges that they've been dealing with their kids. So that, when one is doing respite nights or respite activities for kids with special needs, it's very easy to include kids with mental health issues simply by offering respite not just to the child in question, but to the quote-unquote typical peers, so that the child, who's attending that kind of an event with a mental health condition doesn't feel like they're being singled out as having a special need because they're part of an activity that is explicitly including other kids, who are thought of as typical. There are other supports that your church might consider offering if you have people with this background and the training to do it. Parents are oftentimes very frustrated by the need to work with their schools around accommodations and supports and services for kids who have mental health conditions, so that advocating for them is oftentimes very helpful. Oftentimes when you have a kid or a teen with these conditions, school becomes a problem, and the availability of one-on-one tutoring support can be very helpful. There are several different educational strategies and small group strategies that have been developed and that are in place at churches around the country, and increasingly around the world, that might help meet some of the education and support needs internally of your congregation around mental health issues, but also, as outreach into the community and support for folks in the community who are wrestling with these issues. Wonderful organization that we've had an opportunity to work with is Mental Health Grace Alliance out of Texas. That they have developed curriculum for several types of grace groups, so that these are educational groups and support groups that have a specific agenda that are oftentimes hosted in churches for adults with mental health conditions and trauma and their family members. Mental Health Grace Alliance also has an excellent program that they've developed for training and education when church leadership feels that they need it around ministry to folks with significant mental health concerns. The National Alliance for Mental Illness is often looking for churches willing to host what they call family-to-family and peer-to-peer, which are, again, time-limited educational groups for families with adults with mental illness and families with children with mental illness, to help them to have a better understanding of the nature of the conditions and to understand better where to find support. A very innovative approach is Fresh Hope, which involves support groups that are Christian-based for adults with mood disorders that were started by a guy named Brad Hoffs, who's a Lutheran pastor in Omaha, Nebraska, who had been the pastor of the largest Lutheran church in his denomination before having an episode of bipolar disorder approximately 20 years ago. So that Brad has been very passionate about reaching out to other folks in the church who struggle with these issues, and that they have a curriculum together for Fresh Hope groups, that is all based upon Scripture, that has been very, very helpful in the churches where it's been implemented. Churches might also consider offering certain diagnostic specific support groups, so that CHAD, or children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is an example of like a specific group that could meet a significant need within the community, and offering a stable place that's willing to host and support these groups is oftentimes a great benefit to your community. And finally, the last inclusion strategy we need to look at is how you give responsibility for this ministry to your people. If you're on a church staff or if you're a pastor, there are so many demands placed upon your time that it's not realistic to expect you to be the one who's going to fully implement these plans. And so that part of what you want to do is that you want to empower your people to be able to meet needs wherever they see them. Libby Peterson is a former board member of our ministry, and she is the family ministry director at our church. There's a family that I'm aware of in our church who was struggling with a daughter who had schizophrenia. Libby came by their house one day to see what practical way she could help, and she ended up picking up a mop because mom needed help that day being able to clean the floors because there were a lot of other things going on in the house. Relational respite is another way that people can provide support. So that you don't necessarily need to have a respite program in your church building, but if you empower the small groups in your church to adopt one family in your community with one child or one adult that is wrestling with mental health issues, and you port the support and you port the respite into their house as opposed to needing a formal structured program, it's a great way of meeting immediate needs, and it also drives families into the relationship structure of your church. Because one of the things that families with mental illness, impacted by mental illness, and individuals with mental illness most want is friends, and that's something that we as a church ought to be able to provide. Oftentimes folks will do better with one-on-one discipleship as opposed to being maybe part of a larger group. Parents may need mentors, but one of the ways that we can oftentimes be a great blessing, to our friends and neighbors in the community is simply by offering a ministry of presence and being with them, as they go through the struggles that they go through. So there you have it. That's, 7 specific inclusion strategies for welcoming, kids and families impacted by mental illness. In the next videos in our series, we're going to talk specifically about how one might apply those strategies to the 7 barriers we described earlier, to help folks with mental illness fully participate and be included as part of our churches. Thank you.